It was late in the year, not so long ago, when a man surveying the forests in the Austrian mountains noticed something that did not belong. He was using one of those new mapping contraptions, the kind that can see through the trees to the shape of the earth beneath, and there, some 47 kilometers from Salzburg, he saw shadows that were too straight, too perfect for nature. They were the faint outlines of geometry, buried under 80 years of pine needles and fallen leaves. When the digging team finally came and broke through a hidden entrance, they found themselves in a series of concrete rooms, a bunker complex that had been wiped clean from every map and official record. Inside, stacked against the damp walls, were 23 wooden crates. There were uniforms on hangers, the cloth still holding its shape, and a logbook left open on a steel desk. The last entry was dated January 17, 1945. The signature was that of an SS Oberfuhrer named Wilhelm Monk, one of the last officers with Hitler in the bunker in Berlin. He was a man with a heavy past, tied to many dark deeds of the war, a man everyone believed had died in a Soviet prison camp. But this place, this forgotten hole in the ground, told a different tale. That surveyor had, by chance, uncovered one of the war's most carefully hidden paths away from the reckoning. The story of this place doesn't begin in the quiet of the Austrian Alps, but in the frozen misery of Bastogne. Wilhelm Monk was not just another officer. By the winter of 1944, this man of 33 years commanded a battle group pieced together from what was left of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's own bodyguard regiment. These were the men thrown into Germany's last great gamble in the West, the offensive through the Ardennes that the Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. Monk had a name for himself. Back in 1940, during the invasion of France, his men were looked into for the killing of 80 British prisoners near a place called Wormhout. The investigation, however, simply faded away. Monk had friends in high places. By 1944, he had seen every front. France, Yugoslavia, the endless plains of the East. He had been wounded 4 times, given medal after medal, and promoted for a kind of forward-moving spirit that other, more careful officers called simple brutality. His own men walked lightly around him. His commanders saw his value. It was a dangerous combination in a man. On the 16th of December, 1944, his battle group pushed into the Ardennes, part of the northern drive that was meant to reach Antwerp. The plan was a simple one on paper. Break the American lines, take their fuel, and drive for the coast to split the Allied armies. Monk's part of the map included the roads to Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne had scraped holes in the frozen ground. The Americans were not expected to hold out, but they did. The weather was a punishment. The temperature fell to 20 degrees below zero. The snow turned the roads to sheets of ice, and a man could see no farther than a few feet in front of his face. Monk's supply lines were stretched thin, then broken. His tanks were thirsty for fuel his quartermasters could not bring. The American artillery began to find their mark. By the 23rd of December, when the clouds finally broke and the Allied planes returned to the sky, the German attack was already bleeding to a stop. Bastogne held. The Americans began to push back. Monk pulled his battle group back on the 26th of December. The official records, the Wehrmacht papers, show him fighting a rearguard action through January of 1945. Then, they say he was given new orders, a reassignment to Berlin for the final defense of the capital. It looked like a standard wartime transfer. Except, years later, when men who study such things looked closely at those orders found in 2019, they saw something was wrong. The signature that sent him to Berlin was not a real one. The paper itself was not the kind the Wehrmacht used. Someone had built a road of paper for Wilhelm Monk, a road that led to Berlin, while the real man walked a different way entirely. No one knew then that he had started to plan his vanishing even before the guns around Bastogne had fallen silent. The papers in that Austrian bunker would change the whole story of the war's final months. They showed that Monk was not working by himself. The last time anyone could say for certain they saw Wilhelm Monk on the battlefield was on the 12th of January, 1945, near a town in Belgium called Sankt Vith. His adjutant, a Hauptsturmführer named Klaus Mertens, wrote down the battle group's position and the number of men lost. After that, Monk's name disappears from the frontline reports for 6 full days. When it appears again on the 18th of January, the official record places him in Berlin, in a meeting at SS headquarters. But that meeting never took place. What truly happened in those 6 missing days was a secret kept for nearly 80 years. The documents from the Austrian bunker filled in the empty spaces on the calendar. On the 13th of January, Monk left his command post at 30 minutes before 4 in the morning. He was in a Kabelwagen with 2 officers he trusted, an Obersturmführer named Franz Schreiber and an Unterscharfer, Otto Kastner. They had with them 3 metal cases marked with the SS runes and a leather satchel. They drove southeast, not west toward the new German lines. The 3 men reached Innsbruck on the 15th of January, having used false travel papers to get past the checkpoints. Monk had been laying this path since October of 1944, a time when he must have seen that the end was coming and Germany's situation could not be turned around. He had moved money through men in Switzerland, hidden supplies and caches across Austria, and chosen the site for his bunker. It was a half-finished mountain fort, given up in 1943 when all hands and materials were needed on the Eastern Front. The bunker sat high up on the mountain, at 1,847 meters, reached only by a logging track that washed away in the spring rains. It was the perfect place to be alone. Monk and his 2 men spent 4 days carrying supplies up from a hiding place 12 kilometers away. They brought food, ammunition, documents, and money in 5 different currencies, along with false identity papers. The logbook found in 2023 lists every item. It was the methodical work of a man preparing for a long wait. On the 17th of January, 1945, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Monk wrote the last words in his logbook. Position secure. Communications established. Awaiting developments. Then he closed the bunker. He had set up a charge to cause an avalanche. He pulled a single wire, and tons of rock and snow slid down, covering the entrance, making it invisible from the air or the ground. He left the next day, but he did not go back to the war. The forged orders that put him in Berlin came from Schreiber, who had returned to the battle group on the 19th of January. He told a story about the Oberfuhrer being called away for a special assignment. In the chaos of the collapsing Reich, the army bureaucracy accepted it. There was no reason not to. Officers were disappearing all the time. One more reassignment was just another piece of paper. The official story Monk told after the war was that he was captured by the Soviets in Berlin on the 2nd of May, 1945, and then spent 10 years in their prison camps. He was released in 1955 and lived a quiet life in Hamburg until he died in 2001. The Soviets said his story was true. It matched what other SS officers had gone through. No one saw a reason to question it. The paperwork was there. There were men who said they remembered seeing him. The matter was closed. What really took place in those last months of the war would stay a mystery for 78 years. The things the investigators found next would uncover a whole network that helped dozens of SS officers disappear. And Monk was only the start of it. In May of 1945, when the Allies were making their lists of men wanted for war crimes, Wilhelm Monk's name was on them. Soviet intelligence reports mentioned him. The old investigation into the Wormhout massacre had come up again. The British wanted to ask him questions. Then the Soviet authorities announced that he had been captured in the ruins of the fur bunker on the 2nd of May. And so the case was closed. Or it seemed to be. Monk's family was told through the Red Cross in 1947 that he was alive in a Soviet camp. His wife, Anna, filled out the necessary forms. News came now and then through the 1950s, following the same pattern as for other German prisoners held by the Soviets. When Chancellor Adenauer arranged for the release of the last German prisoners in 1955, Monk came home. He gave a few interviews, always careful, always controlled. He spoke of the fall of Berlin, his captivity, the interrogations. His story lined up with what other survivors said. The details seemed right, but the British were still suspicious. The business at Wormhout had cost 80 men of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment their lives. Survivors had identified Monk's unit, but getting him to stand trial was impossible. West Germany did not hand over its own citizens, and the trail of evidence had grown cold. The investigation finally stopped for good in 1957. Monk lived without making waves in Hamburg. He worked in the import-export business and kept to himself. When reporters tracked him down in the 1980s, looking for stories about the last days in the bunker, he gave them only short statements and would not say more. And yet, there were things that didn't quite fit. French intelligence had a report of someone who looked like Monk being seen in Bavaria in 1946, but it was never confirmed. A Soviet document, made public in 1992, spoke of an SS officer who matched Monk's description escaping Berlin just before the surrender. The report was set aside as a simple mix-up in the paperwork. Records from that time were known to be a mess. A German historian named Karl Mayer, who spoke with Monk in 1985, noticed something strange. He knew all the details, Mayer wrote. He knew about the Soviet interrogation methods, the daily life in the camps, the process of being released. Everything was just as other prisoners had described it. But when I asked him about certain camps or specific interrogators, his answers were like they came from a textbook. It was as if he had memorized another man's life. The mystery should have ended when Monk died on the 6th of August, 2001, in Barsptal. His death notices listed his war service, touched briefly on the controversies, and mentioned his time as a prisoner. The archives were closed. The city of Hamburg filed his death certificate. He was just another old soldier, gone. The war's secrets, it was thought, were dying with that generation. For all those years, the Austrian Alps held their secret. The bunker complex sat quiet and undisturbed through the long years of the Cold War. The old logging track had vanished under new growth by 1950. Hikers sometimes passed within a few hundred meters of it, but the entrance stayed hidden beneath the rockfall and the tall pines. The Austrian government had stopped looking for old mountain forts after 1955. There was no reason to search empty mountains for defenses that were no longer of any use. In 1978, a local historian named Joseph Brunner was researching these alpine positions for a small museum. He found papers in the Wehrmacht engineering archives that mentioned the site, listed as unfinished, not in use, and abandoned in 1943. He went to the coordinates in the summer of 1979, but saw only forest. He made a note that it was lost to nature, and his report was filed away in an archive in Salzburg, where it gathered dust. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 opened up the Soviet archives. Researchers found bits and pieces, papers about SS escape networks, talk of safe houses in Austria, and hidden caches of supplies, but nothing solid. The KGB had followed some of these trails during the Cold War, but they had more pressing matters of espionage than chasing old Nazi fugitives. The leads all went cold. Technology for historical work moved slowly. Ground-penetrating radar was available, but it cost a fortune. Aerial surveying with lasers was not a practical tool for everyday use until the 2010s. The Austrian Forestry Service only started its systematic mapping with this technology in 2021. Money was tight, so the Alpine regions had to wait. When the funds were finally approved in 2023, the survey teams began their methodical work, grid by grid. Monk's death in 2001 had caused a brief, small renewal of interest in his war record. British journalists tried one more time to build a case about Wormhout. They spoke with the survivors, men then in their 80s. But the evidence was still what it had always been, not quite enough. The investigation was closed again in 2003. No one would ever be prosecuted. All the while, his family stood by his story. His time in the Soviet camps was real. The records in Hamburg showed his employment after the war, his tax payments, his registered address, the shape of a normal life. A few historians remembered what Karl Mayer had written about the inconsistencies, but without hard proof, it was just talk. The official story remained as it was. Monk fought until Berlin fell, was captured by the Soviets, released in 1955, and died in 2001. A life with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Then, in November of 2023, the world shifted. The laser mapping data showed something no one had ever expected to see. It showed geometric patterns that did not match any known Austrian fort, which suggested this was not just a bunker. It was a stopping place on a hidden road. The Austrian Federal Forest Department had hired a surveyor, Markus Lindner, and his team to map the Salzburg Alpine sectors in September of 2023. The technology they used sends down pulses of laser light that pass through the forest leaves and branches to map the true shape of the ground with great precision. It was turning up all sorts of forgotten things, from old Roman roads to the foundations of medieval castles. On the 8th of November, Lindner was looking at the data from a 12-square-kilometer patch of ordinary pine forest. The laser returns showed lines that were too straight, corners that were too sharp. It looked like the foundation of a wall. I first thought it was an old hunting lodge, Lindner later told the investigators. But it was too large and built like a defensive position. Whoever made it wanted it to be hidden and to have clear sight lines. Lindner checked it against the old Wehrmacht engineering archives. The location matched an abandoned project, A447, listed as incomplete and stripped for materials in 1943. But the laser map showed finished structures. Either the records were wrong, or someone had finished the work quietly, off the books. Lindner reported his finding to the Austrian War Graves Commission on the 12th of November. They passed it on to the federal police. The excavation team arrived on the 19th of November. It was made up of archaeologists, structural engineers, and a historian from Vienna. They used ground-penetrating radar to see the full size of the place before they moved a single stone. The complex was 47 meters long and 18 meters wide, buried under 3 meters of soil and fallen rock. The entrance had been sealed on purpose. On the 23rd of November, at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning, they broke through. The condition inside was remarkable. The air had been sealed off, the temperature was stable, and there was very little moisture. In the main room, they found storage racks holding Wehrmacht crates with their serial numbers still clear. And then they found the papers. 23 wooden crates were stacked against the east wall, each one labeled in German. Command staff records. The forensic team took photographs of everything just as they found it. The logbook was on a metal desk. It was leather-bound and stained by water, but a man could still read the writing. The last date was January 17, 1945. The signature read, W. Monk, SS-Brigadeführer. What they found inside those crates would have shaken even the most seasoned recovery team. The documents laid bare a network that tied Monk to contacts in the Vatican, to bank accounts in Switzerland, and to an operation of changing identities that fooled Soviet intelligence for a decade. A woman from Vienna, Dr. Elisabeth Hoffman, led the team that studied the documents. They started with the logbook. It had 126 pages of daily notes, from October 1944 to January 1945. Monk's handwriting was a match to samples from other army documents known to be his. An analysis of the paper confirmed it was German military stock from the 1940s. The ink was the standard issue. There was no chance it was a forgery. The logbook recorded the movement of supplies. October 12, 1944. 6 crates of medical supplies delivered to A447. October 28. Currency exchange completed. 47,000 Reichsmarks changed to Swiss francs through Zurich contact. November 15. Identity papers prepared for contingency. 3 sets complete. Every entry was neat, methodical, showing an almost paranoid care for detail. The 23 crates held more. There were personnel files for 34 other SS officers. Not just their names and service records, but detailed plans for their escape, with routes through Austria to Italy, names of contacts in Innsbruck, Bolzano, and Genoa. There were mentions of a network of assistants from the Vatican, with coded references to certain priests. There were financial records that showed money moved through a Swiss bank in Zurich, complete with account numbers and access codes. Dr. Hoffman's team checked the names against the lists of known SS fugitives from after the war. 12 of the names belonged to men who were supposed to have died in the war's final weeks. 7 were men who later appeared in Argentina and Paraguay. 4 were men who, like Monk, had claimed to be prisoners of the Soviets and returned to West Germany in the 1950s. Then they found the personal things. 3 Wehrmacht uniforms, the dress uniforms of an officer, but with the insignia taken off. 2 sets of civilian clothes with Swiss labels. And false identity papers for a man named Werner Meyer, with an altered birth date and the occupation of mechanical engineer. There were photographs of Monk in these civilian clothes, taken in what experts identified as a photo studio in Basel, in October of 1944. The forensic laboratory in Vienna took hair samples from a Wehrmacht cap found in the bunker. They compared the DNA to Monk's medical records from a hospital stay in Hamburg in the 1970s. It was a perfect match. There was no doubt this was his bunker. But the papers held something no one could have foreseen. There was correspondence with Soviet intelligence. Letters, dated from March through August of 1945, were written in German and addressed to a comrade Volkov. The words on the page were staggering. Monk was offering information on the SS command structure, the names of war criminals, details about transfers of Nazi gold. What he wanted in return was stated plainly: a guarantee of safe passage and protection in exchange for his cooperation. A historian from Humboldt University, Dr. Klaus Bergmann, looked at this Soviet connection. "This explains it all," he said. Monk made a deal. He gave them intelligence, valuable intelligence that the Soviets wanted for their own war crimes trials and to hold over West Germany. In return, the Soviets created a false record of his captivity. 10 years in the Gulag that never happened. When he was released in 1955, he had the perfect story. He was a victim of Soviet cruelty, not a war criminal on the run. The bunker had a radio transmitter. It was of British make, probably captured equipment. The logs showed it had been used in early 1945, on frequencies that were known to be used by Soviet intelligence channels. Monk had been talking to his Soviet handlers from the bunker. The financial records told the rest of the story. Between January and June of 1945, Monk traveled between Austria and Switzerland 7 times on his false papers. He met his Soviet contacts in Zurich on neutral ground. The exchange of information took place over several months. By the time Berlin fell, the deal was done. Monk did not get captured in the rubble of Berlin at all. He surrendered to Soviet officers in Prague on the 4th of June, 1945. The greatest secret was found in a locked metal case buried beneath the floorboards. Inside were 127 photographs. Some were of Wormhout in 1940, showing British prisoners, German soldiers, the site of the massacre. Others showed places in Yugoslavia, Poland, and the Ukraine. It was documentary proof of war crimes Monk had either taken part in or witnessed. It was his insurance. If the Soviets went back on their word, he could threaten to make it all public. If the West ever caught him, he could offer it all to the Soviets for prosecution. It was leverage. The case also held personal letters to his wife, Anna. They were never sent. In them, he detailed his escape plan, promised he would return, and told her to stick to the story of his captivity. "Tell them I fought in Berlin," he wrote. "Tell them the Soviets took me. Trust no one with the truth." The letters were dated May 1945 and written from Innsbruck. What they found in the last crate would rewrite the history of the post-war Nazi escape networks. It would prove that Monk was not just running away. He was running an operation. The proof was beyond question. Wilhelm Monk never fought in the Battle of Berlin. He never spent 10 years in a Soviet prison camp. His entire life after the war was a careful lie, a story constructed with the help of Soviet intelligence. The timeline was now clear. Monk began to plan his disappearance in October of 1944, when the Ardennes offensive was still on the drawing board, but when any thinking man could see that Germany's strategic position was hopeless. He moved supplies to the Austrian bunker, set up financial channels through Switzerland, and created his false identities. The Battle of Bastogne gave him the cover he needed to slip away in January 1945. Between January and June of that year, Monk moved between Austria and Switzerland, negotiating his deal with the Soviets. He offered them everything he knew about the SS command structure: names, locations, financial networks, and documentation of war crimes. The Soviets had many reasons for wanting this information. They could use it to prosecute war criminals, to put pressure on West German politicians who had Nazi pasts, and to understand the Ratlines that were helping SS officers escape to South America. The deal they made was a clever one. Monk would surrender to Soviet forces, but with a false story of his capture. Soviet records would show that he was held in various camps from 1945 to 1955. Other German prisoners would be told he was there with them, and when they returned home, they would repeat the story. Monk, in his safe captivity, would continue to provide intelligence on Nazi networks. Then, in 1955, when Adenauer negotiated the release of prisoners, Monk would come home with the perfect cover story. A victim of Soviet imprisonment, not a fugitive war criminal. The official report of his capture in Berlin had not been a mistake born of chaos, it was a deliberate falsehood created by the Soviets. They needed his cooperation, and they needed him to eventually return to West Germany, where he could keep reporting on former SS officers who had not made similar deals. The papers in the bunker proved that Monk helped at least 11 other SS officers escape between March and May of 1945. The bunker was a way station. Men would arrive, be given new papers, money, and a route to Italy. From there, networks connected to the Vatican would move them to South America. Monk arranged it all, taking a portion of their money to pay for his own arrangement with the Soviets. The final crate held the proof that closed the matter for good. It was a list of 127 SS officers, with their real identities, their new names, their destinations, and their status as of January 1960. Monk had kept up his intelligence work on the entire network for 15 years after his so-called release. He had been a Soviet asset the whole time, sending back updates that were filed away by the KGB, information on West German politicians, businessmen, and officials with pasts in the SS. When he died in 2001, the Cold War was long over and the Soviets had no more use for him or his information. But the deal had held for 46 years. It was one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets, hidden all that time in an Austrian mountain. The bunker is now sealed, under the protection of the Austrian government. Its contents have been moved to climate-controlled archives in Vienna. The documents have forced a rewriting of our understanding of the post-war Nazi escape networks and Soviet intelligence operations. 23 old investigations in 3 different countries have been reopened because of what was found there. Anna, Monk's wife, died in 1987. She told the story of her husband's captivity until the very end. We will never know if she did it out of loyalty or out of fear. Their children learned the truth from Austrian investigators in 2024. The Austrian government plans to put a historical marker at the site, not to remember Monk, but to mark the deception. History is a complicated thing. Sometimes the good men needed the bad men, and the bad men knew it. The truth takes its time. Sometimes it takes 80 years. The Austrian Alps kept Wilhelm Monk's secret for 78 of them. Now, it is a secret no longer. And somewhere in a declassified KGB file, there is likely a folder with his code name and a final note. Asset terminated, natural causes, 2001. Case closed. Sometimes the truth takes 8 decades, but it is worth the wait.